Hey there, here to introduce my second week of quarantine quadruple features. For those of you that don't know, every Saturday night I program a quartet of films that are thematically linked, and I make the recommendations public in case you want to follow along with any of the movies. A couple quick notes: I don't program the same director more than once a night. So to keep the films as stylistically different as possible, I'm not going to feature the same director 2 or 3 times, with the exception of a few weeks where I will screen all 4 movies from the same director, but that's going to be the exception to the rule, and we're only going to do that a few times. Another thing, what this is basically just me introducing a film to recommend, and then kind of doing a deep dive into my thoughts on the film. Again, I'm not a movie critic. These are just movies that I love and that I want to tell you a little bit about. So I just talk about the films it'll probably usually take about, 5 to 15 minutes or so, doing a deep dive, sometimes not such a deep dive, into some of these films. I don't keep any notes. This is basically just what I'm thinking as I'm talking about the films. So, sometimes I might mess up a year, or I might kind of get a name wrong or something like that. That's because it's just kind of coming to me as I'm talking about it. But these are, hopefully I will have most of the information correct, because they are all movies that I love and want to recommend. So during week 2 of quarantine, I was still pretty stressed out. I was still pretty nervous. And when it came time to program a movie, I just wanted cinematic comfort food. I wanted movies that were going to make me feel better at the time. I just wanted to watch 4 movies I could really relax and just get into. I'm a child of the 80s. I love horror comedies, so it seemed natural for week 2 to be 80s horror comedies. Okay, first 80s horror comedy is Stuart Gordon's Re-Animator. I love Re-Animator. This is one of my favorite horror comedies of all time. I think it is so funny, and it also balances the comedy and the horror exceptionally, better than almost any other horror comedy that's been made. This was Stuart Gordon's first film, and it's rare that a filmmaker comes straight out the gate so fully formed. In fact, I still think this is the best movie that he made. This quarantine quadruple feature was for March 28th. Stuart Gordon actually passed away on the 24th. I didn't program this movie in honor of him because he passed away or anything. I programmed it because I watch this movie probably about once a year because I love it so much. But it's also good to watch it and remember Stuart Gordon, a really great filmmaker who left a legacy of really terrific films. This movie stars Barbara Crampton, who's an absolute knockout in the movie, one of my longtime cinematic crushes. She's also great in the film. It also stars Jeffrey Combs, who is incredible. He is so funny. And, I actually never even really realized just how funny the movie was until I saw it with a sold-out audience. And this thing plays like gangbusters with a group. It is so funny. There's a scene where Barbara Crampton finds her cat dead in a refrigerator, and she thinks Jeffrey Combs did it, and he tries to say he just put the cat in there because he found it dead and he didn't want it to go bad. And she's like, "Why didn't you leave a note?" And he's like, "What should it have said? Cat dead, details later?" And that's a very bad retelling of it, but it's such a funny line. Gina and I still say that to each other all the time. Cat dead, details later. Cracks me up. It's a terrific movie. It's kind of like a modern telling of Frankenstein, but it's based off of a story by H.P. Lovecraft. It veers in a few directions that the story doesn't delve into. The only real issue I can take with the film is that the theme is shockingly similar to the theme from Psycho. The score by Richard Brand is great, but the theme that plays during the opening and end credits is so similar that I'm surprised that legal action wasn't taken. But I don't blame Richard Brand for that. He was just kind of following directions, and the note he was given was Psycho. But it's hard to not think of Psycho when you're watching the opening credits. Even the way the credits are designed, which is really cool, is also very reminiscent of the way Saul Bass did his opening titles, which he did for a lot of Hitchcock films as well. If you remember, in American Beauty, there's a scene where 2 people are getting stoned, and they're talking about a horror movie where a severed head does something lascivious with someone. This is the movie they're talking about. It is pretty outrageous. It pushes the boundaries of good taste, but it's also just an exceptionally crafted horror film. Can't recommend it enough. What they managed to accomplish with a relatively limited budget is phenomenal. Great effects, great performances, great direction. Love this movie. Okay, movie number 2 is from 1985. It is House, not to be confused with the version from 1977. That was a Japanese film we're actually going to be watching in a few weeks. But House is directed by Steve Miner, who's actually quite a pivotal character in the history of horror. He directed Halloween H2O, the 7th installment in the Halloween series that brought Jamie Lee Curtis back after a 20-year hiatus in the series. He also directed Friday the 13th, Part 2, which has my favorite iteration of Jason, where he's got the pillowcase over his face. He also directed Friday the 13th, Part 3, which is noteworthy because that's the movie where Jason got his hockey mask. So that was all under the eye of Steve Miner. He also directed House. This movie is wild. It combines so many crazy elements. The guy's a Vietnam War vet who's being haunted by his buddy who died in the war, who comes back as kind of a scary zombie dude. He's lost a child. His wife has divorced him. He's trying to write a book in this haunted house that his aunt committed suicide in. There's all kinds of really bizarre elements that the movie is balancing, but it balances everything pretty well. Now, it's not too scary. It's actually more of a comedy. It balances the horror and comedy sort of effectively, but it is pretty silly. That being said, it scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. There are these two goblin things that carry a kid up a chimney, and one of the goblin things kind of poking its head out from the chimney horrified me as a kid. That image just burned in my brain. There's also kind of a demonic version of his wife. And watching it today, she's a big rubber costume that's a little silly looking. When I was a kid, she really freaked me out. And the detail that really scared me was she has these big claws on her mutant hands, but they're still painted with red nail polish. And for some reason, it really fucking horrified me. And the severed hand, her hand gets cut off and it does spooky things. That hand really, really freaked me out when I was a kid. By today's standards, it's not actually very scary. It's not my favorite horror comedy. I do like it and I recommend it just as a bizarre, fun viewing experience. But there's a very specific reason why I'm recommending House this week that I'm actually not going to be able to reveal for quite a while in this series of Quarantine Quadruple Features. The score is by Harry Manfredini, and if you don't know who that is, he's a very famous composer, and you've definitely heard his work before because he's the person who wrote... He did the scores for almost all of the Friday the 13th movies. And House is produced by Sean S. Cunningham, who directed the original Friday the 13th. And he's the one who hired Harry Manfredini to do the score for that movie. So when he was producing this movie, he decided to call up his old friend to do the score for this one as well. And the score is very fun and crazy to match the film. Movie number 3 is a flat-out fucking masterpiece, Dan O'Bannon's Return of the Living Dead. This is another movie that I cannot recommend highly enough. I try to get people to watch this movie until I am blue in the face. Like Re-Animator, I think it is. These are the two best horror comedies of the 80s, and a lot of people kind of view American Werewolf in London as the best horror comedy of the 80s, and I do love that movie a lot as well. However, I view that one as more of a straight-up horror film that happens to be very funny, and it sounds very specific, but I think there is a distinction between a funny horror film and a horror comedy. This one is aiming for goofy and scary in equal measure, and I think it balances it pretty well. American Werewolf in London is mainly scary, but it's also pretty funny. But this movie is a straight-up horror comedy. It is really funny, and it does the horror really well as well. Now, this is also one that I have seen with a sold-out audience, also played like gangbusters, multiple rounds of applause throughout. There's a lot of really noteworthy things. It's written and directed by Dan O'Bannon, who, of course, wrote the screenplay for Ridley Scott's masterpiece, Alien. So he's a very pivotal figure in horror and science fiction as well. This movie is kind of an unofficial sequel to Night of the Living Dead. It was originally intended to be sort of a sequel, but George Romero had already made a sequel for Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead was the sequel to Night of the Living Dead, but this still is kind of a sequel in spirit, and it actually references Night of the Living Dead. In the beginning of the movie, they treat Night of the Living Dead as a movie that exists in this universe, but what you don't know is it's based on a true story. So it gets a little meta. It doesn't break the fourth wall, but there's some nodding and winking at the audience in a far more effective way than most films did in the 80s. You see a lot of films trying to emulate that kind of style now because they're not bold enough to just go for a straight horror narrative. They have to be like, hey, we're in on the joke. But this movie was starting the joke. It stars Clu Gulager, who's phenomenal. He's still an actor who's with us today, and he's a wonderful actor. In fact, all the performances across the board are really great. Dan O'Bannon also wrote a book on screenwriting about how he structures all of his screenplays. And I recommend this as well. If you're a screenwriter, this is a pretty interesting read, whether you decide to go with like how he does an act structure or not. It's still really cool to learn how a master of the craft approached screenwriting. So I recommend reading this book as well. But our third movie, O'Bannon's masterpiece, Return of the Living Dead. Okay, movie number 4 is Night of the Comet. Night of the Comet is a blast. It's really fun. It stars Kelly Maroney and Catherine Mary Stewart. Earlier, I talked about Barbara Crampton being one of my longtime cinematic crushes. Kelly Maroney as well. In fact, both of the girls in this movie are phenomenal. They give such good performances. They play sisters, and their relationship is so fun and sweet and engaging and believable. It was a movie I really loved as a kid, and I still love watching this now. And anyone that argues that a woman isn't going to be able to bring in as much of an audience as a male protagonist is, I mean, it's just flat out wrong, because when I was watching this as a kid, I was just as engaged by these two women that were on the screen the whole time as I was by any movie where it was men on the screen the entire time, if not more so, because I was seeing characters represented that I didn't see all the time. And again, the dynamic of their relationship is just really beautiful. So I would strongly recommend watching the movie, mainly just for the two leads, but also it's just a really fun horror comedy. It takes a look at the apocalypse in a pretty unique way. And in a strange way that I didn't realize when I initially programmed this quadruple feature, all 4 of these movies are zombie movies, but all 4 of them approach the zombie genre in drastically different ways. But Night of the Comet is no exception. There are certainly some spooky-ass zombies in this movie, very different than the zombies in all the other movies. But that's number 4, wrapping up our night of horror comedies, Night of the Comet.